Welcome everyone to our session on using APA style to improve information literacy and combat misinformation in the classroom. As you're joining us, please feel free to tell us where you're joining from and your role in the chat. We're going to start with some housekeeping items. We do have a large group today, so it will take a while for everyone to join us from the waiting room. So I'll go over these housekeeping items and I will also put them in the chat as I conclude. So again, welcome to everyone. My name is Andrea Bergoa. I am the Higher Ed Marketing Manager here at APA. We're so glad to have you here with us today. First of all, I want to address communication. Although all attendees are muted to prevent any accidental noises or distraction, we are striving to provide multiple modes of communication for this session. Chat is open and available, so please use that to communicate with your fellow attendees. If you have questions for anyone here on the panel today or APA style experts, please put those in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We have also enabled auto captioning, and it can be accessed via the closed captioning button in your Zoom options bar at the bottom, actually right next to Q&A. As soon as it is available, we will be sharing a recording of this webinar that includes captions and a chat transcript for everyone who is registered for today's session, and we will also share PDFs of resources where appropriate. Finally, as recognition for your attendance today, you will be receiving an attendance certificate and badge that you can download and share on social media or put into your CV. Please look for that in the coming days and be a little bit patient with us as that is a manual process. Again, we want to thank you for attending our session on APA style and information literacy. For those who are new to APA style, I'm just going to start out with a little bit of background on where and how APA style is used. It is the most widely used academic writing style in the world and is used in many disciplines outside of the social sciences, including business, education, and nursing, and it is used in more than 70% of bachelor's, master's, and doctoral degrees. APA Style's goal is to help students become clear, precise, and inclusive writers, and to support that goal, we publish regular APA Style blog posts, send a monthly newsletter, and host webinars like these. So if you'd like to learn more about how and where APA Style is used, I'll include a link in the chat, but we're going to go ahead and continue on with our presentation. I'm going to turn things over to our presenters, Samantha Denny from the APA Style team and Melony Shemberger from Murray State University.
Thanks, Andrea. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar. We will be discussing using APA style to improve information literacy and combat misinformation in the classroom. My name is Samantha Denny, and I'm a development manager on the APA style team, which is the team responsible for the creation, modification, and promotion of APA style guidelines and products like the publication manual. I'm here with our special guest, Dr. Melony Shemberger, Professor of Journalism and Mass Communication at Murray State University. In addition to her doctorate in education, Melony is working on her master's in library and information science. Today, we will be talking about how APA style relates to information literacy and how to use APA style to combat misinformation in the classroom. As Andrea mentioned, we should have time for questions. So please put any questions for us in the Q&A. Feel free to use the chat to talk amongst yourselves, make any comments, chat with the other attendees. But if you'd like to make sure that we see your question, you can use the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. We also have Tim and Ayana from the APA style team answering some questions in the Q&A. So you might see your questions answered there. On the APA style team, we see APA style and information literacy as topics that go together toward the common goal of good academic research and writing skills. Sometimes students can see style as a set of rules regarding only the mechanics of writing or citing a source. But APA style guidelines were created in service of good scholarship. Instead of just blindly following rules, understanding our guidelines can help students better understand how to identify, use, and credit good sources. So let's talk about what information literacy is. What are we talking about when we say information literacy? Information literacy is a set of integrated abilities encompassing the reflective discovery of information, the understanding of how information is produced and valued, and the use of that information in creating new knowledge and participating ethically in communities of learning. In today's environment, information is everywhere. So it is less likely that a student won't be able to find any information, and more likely that they're going to find a lot of information and have a little bit of trouble determining the value and legitimacy of that information. Skills associated with information literacy can not only help students in their academic lives, but can help them become lifelong learners. So when people don't have great information literacy skills, they may perpetuate some misinformation, disinformation, or even malinformation. So we have some definitions here where misinformation is unintentional mistakes such as inaccurate citations, dates, or statistics. Disinformation is fabricated and deliberately manipulated content, and malinformation is deliberately publishing information for the purpose of causing harm. For our purposes, we will be focusing on misinformation and disinformation, as we believe that the vast majority of students who perpetuate misinformation do so from a lack of information literacy skills instead of any intent to harm. So we're going to ask you guys a little bit about your experience with misinformation and disinformation. So Andrea, if you could generate the poll, what is the biggest misinformation problem for you and your students? So the options here are, do you see that students present information without attribution? Are they making mistakes when they are providing information or citations without intent to harm, but it's perpetuating misinformation? Maybe they're using inappropriate sources that are not credible, or they could be fabricating sources or information. So let us know what you tend to see in your classes or in your institution. So Andrea, did we close the poll?
I will end it in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Great.
And we do understand that it may be more than one of these, but we are looking for the biggest problem. I am seeing that in chat a little bit.
Great. So what we're seeing is really a lot of significant mistakes in information or citations. We're seeing preventing information without attribution and using inappropriate sources. So hold on just one second. I'm sorry, I have a bad cough. So when teaching APA style in the context of information literacy can give students the skills to find, understand, use, and credit scholarly information. As you may know, the principles of APA style are clarity, precision, and inclusion. APA style governs what information is presented in a paper and where. APA style journal article reporting standards promote transparency in research so others can understand and evaluate science and replicate results. Students can often be intimidated or not know where to start when first accessing scholarly information. So one tool that Andrea is going to share with you to help students understand the scholarly information is our Anatomy of a Journal article handout that can help students navigate an academic paper and really know, what does an academic paper and a good scholarly source look like? So Andrea is going to pop that in the chat for you. While we will spend the majority of this conversation talking about scholarly research, misinformation and information literacy are important in our daily lives. The APA resolution on combating misinformation and promoting psychological science literacy contains recommendations to help anyone combat information. This includes avoid repeating misinformation without a correction, leveraging trusted sources to counter misinformation and provide accurate health information, debunk misinformation often and repeatedly using evidence-based methods, and pre-bunk, preemptively warn others about misinformation to inoculate susceptible audiences by building skills and resilience from an early age. So these are things that you're going to see relate both to students, making sure they find those great sources, but also these are things that you can use in your daily life. So let's talk about teaching students to identify good, trusted sources. It can be very difficult for students and really anyone to identify good sources. There's a lot of information available, and not all of it is reliable and credible. Much of it can even be designed to look credible when it isn't. Misinformation can spread very quickly, especially on social media, where there is little fact-checking or oversight, and there are often biases or echo chambers where it is difficult to correct incorrect information. So as I'm sure everybody on this call is aware as educators, where you get your information from is extremely important, as well as your ability to evaluate the source itself for its fitness. So once you've found that potentially good source, the next task is to help students focus on evaluating. It is vital to teach students to critically evaluate sources regardless of how they found them, whether they found them in an academic research database or if they use some other means of finding the sources. Maybe they just do a Google search or ask AI. They need to make sure they're evaluating whatever they find. And Melony has some fantastic exercises that will help you with that later in the presentation. The qualities to look for are that research should be relevant to your topic, which you can usually tell by reading the abstract, that it's written by experts, such as researchers who work at a university, asking yourself, what are the credentials? How does this person know this information that they're sharing? Peer-reviewed by other experts, which you can tell by looking up the journal and reading the journal information. If it's published in an academic journal or book, which you can also tell by looking up the name of the publication to find out more about it, and that it's current or at least not outdated. So APA does not have any specific requirements for dates of sources and things like that, but we understand that some instructors do. So anything that the instructor or journal you're writing for or things like that, anything that they say is important, that would take priority over the APA style specific guidelines. So these qualities that you're looking for, you might notice that they correspond quite neatly to the 4 elements of a reference: author, date, title, and source. So making sure it was written by experts is the author. The currency is the date. The relevance can be determined to a degree from the title, and the publication and peer review corresponds to the source. So having an understanding of the parts of the reference and why they are important can help students to identify, if a reference is something that they might want to use for a paper, but it can also help them spot errors in AI tools and citation managers. So having that background of understanding the foundation of a reference can be extremely important to their knowledge of information literacy. Once you've evaluated sources to determine if they're a good fit, the ones you actually select should have these qualities. First of all, you have to read them yourself. Even if you use something like AI or, a paraphrasing tool or something like that to help you understand what you're reading, you should not be citing anything that you have not read yourself. You should also look for research that supports primary or original research. Some keywords to look for there are words like experiment, empirical, variable, statistical analysis, methods, results, and discussion, qualitative survey, interview. If you have students look for these keywords, it can help them separate actual research reports from popular media reports about research, such as those you would see in popular magazines or newspapers. Another kind of source that you would that a student might be interested in is a source that analyzes existing research. So keywords here include literature review, meta-analysis, systemic review, and synthesis. And these words are often in the title of articles. Once students have identified and read their trustworthy source, ethical attribution is a very important element of the scholarly process. When you do not properly cite a source, sorry, give me 1 second. It can be considered plagiarism, presenting the words, ideas, or images of others without proper attribution as though they were your own. Also, plagiarism and misinformation are related constructs. So when you unintentionally provide falsehoods in information or citations without intent to harm, that is misinformation. Citations allow readers to identify and locate sources. So all sources cited in your text must have a reference list, must be in the reference list entries, and all references must have in-text citations. So that helps an instructor identify where the information is coming from. It helps other scientists and other students possibly replicate the study that you're doing. It's extremely important to help make sure that the information you're using is of good quality and you're not perpetuating misinformation. Make proper source citation a habit. Be careful about what you say and ensure that you can back it up with a source. A helpful tool, especially with students who are doing this for the first time, is our research article activity. So our free research article activity, which Andrea is going to put in the chat for everybody, is going to help students to find, cite, analyze, and paraphrase sources. It features fillable form fields in which students find an article, create the reference list entry and in-text citation, and then analyze the various parts of the article to write about what it says. The students learn step by step how to evaluate aspects of research, such as describing the sample and explaining the results. The end result when you're done is you'll have a 1 or 2 paragraph summary of an article that you can use in research papers. So one topic that comes up quite a bit with regard to information literacy is AI and information literacy. As we all know, the field of AI is changing rapidly and has a major impact on information literacy. AI can create papers, images, videos, and more that look completely legitimate in a lot of situations, even if they're not. So there are some tips to help students navigate this. First of all, make sure that you have a clear and consistent policy for if students can use AI tools and how they can use them. Don't assume that every instructor is going to have the same view. One of a student's professors might say, do not touch any AI tool ever, and another might have them use it quite extensively. So make sure your students can really understand where you draw the line and what your opinion is on use of AI. As we said before, make sure the students are actually reading what they are citing, and that it is kind of a human-centered approach. So the students will need to check the work of AI carefully. We've seen some studies that have told us that that AI tools often either fabricate information, they have incorrect information in citations, they include unsubstantiated sentences, things like that. AI can also be a source of misinformation. And I've said it a few times, but even if you have AI help you with summarizing, make sure you're reading the original work. Also, disclose the use of AI. If you're using AI in your research, that's a good thing to disclose. And I believe Andrea will be incorporating or putting in the chat our blog post on how to cite AI, as well as APA journals, tool on or information on usage of AI. Finally, with most journals, including APA journals, AI cannot be an author or write your paper for you. So, and I believe pretty much every professor has the same kind of rule, but AI tools are not able to agree to a journal's kind of ethical code, and they're not responsible for what they're writing. So it is extremely important that the author is human and is actually checking for any sort of AI output and is responsible for the paper. So I'm going to turn it over to Melony, who's going to give us some in-depth information on specific activities that you can do with students to help their information literacy skills.
Thank you, Samantha. Hello, everyone. I am so glad to be here with you and to share with you some of the activities that I did in helping my students to work more with the APA publication manual, as well as how we incorporated a lot of this information into a course that I teach called Media Literacy and Society. It is a 100 level course at my university. It's required for all the programs of study in my department, which is journalism and mass communication. In addition, it is an elective in our university studies curriculum. So therefore, I get students not only from my own majors, but from across campus. So I feel like with my course, this is a good way to teach not just media literacy, but information literacy. Next slide, please. I'm going to share with you how we did 5 different activities that helped my learners to consider in finding, evaluating, and citing good sources. So we'll look first at the reference building challenge, reference scavenger hunt, source evaluation, advanced search simulation, and then paraphrasing and in-text citations. A couple of notes here about these 5 activities. First, I incorporate a full week. So my course meets twice a week for 75 minutes each. So for that week, I did a library workshop week, in which that is what we did in class sessions, all 5 of these activities. And then also during this time, I also want you to know that I try to scaffold a lot of these things. So the very first activity with reference building challenge, that gets them started, and I'll explain that in a moment. You see to your right of the screen, it says Module 4 Research. One of the requirements in my course is that they have to write a media theory research paper. Again, I scaffold the entire process. So just as I scaffolded the research paper requirement, I also scaffolded all of the different activities here. And I also incorporated those activities a little bit at the bottom of that module. So that way, if students want to go back and reference a little bit of some of the information, they can, but it was also included as assignments because they did get points for participating in these activities. I'm going to share with you for each learning activity some brief instructions and then show you in some cases the practice walkthroughs that I shared with my students in classes, and then also include the activities themselves. One of the things I also require for my section of media literacy and society, they do have to have the physical copy of the APA publication manual. I know you can use it online. I've used it online myself, but I felt that for this type of exercise, I really wanted them to start with the hard copy and to explore it first. That way, then they will know what they are doing online. I have that, I guess I just try to practice that. I feel like sometimes the tangible products will be good enough so that way when you go online, you can really then know what you're looking for. And at my classes with these activities, I brought candy. That might help to some extent. So I had a big bag of candy so that way they could enjoy that as they are working through the activities and we're talking about all of this material. All right, next, please. So let's start first with the reference building challenge. I like this activity because it gets them to begin with something that they care about. And let's put it in their world first. And then we'll break it, basically, then pull it back out to see why this really matters. So I want them to be able to take some pieces of knowledge, what probably those of you who are librarians, you would know as bibliographic data, and then how we take all that and make it into a proper reference. So the materials needed for this, simple just Post-it notes or maybe even index cards will be fine. And then also you might want to prepare a list of some data for various source types as well for later on. And as well as the style guide, maybe you're fortunate to have a number of physical copies of the book in your courses or in your departments. And if not, that's fine. Maybe you might need to instruct your students to bring their devices, computers to be able to access it online. Whichever you prefer is okay. So the way I begin this is I give each student several pieces of Post-it notes. And I tell them that I want you to think of a song or any piece of music. Assume I know nothing about that song, that I am completely oblivious to it. I want to go find that song, though. How would I find it? Don't tell me exactly where to go. Give me pieces of information and one piece per Post-it note. So and to give you an idea of what some of the responses were, I had a student to list the title. Another student listed the performer. Another student even listed genre, which I thought was interesting. Another student listed the source of download, which I thought was pretty impressive. So I received some very similar responses, and then I received some responses that were rather unique. And then the next step is that they had to put each piece of that data, they had to put it together in the order that they thought would be necessary for me to track that. So they then took their Post-it notes and then put each one in a certain order that they felt was relevant, most important element first. And then they got with a neighbor. So we have long desks, so they're able to get to a buddy. And they then looked at each other's to see, could I find that song? And I went around as well to see, okay, can I follow the pathway there? And then I congratulate them. I said, you just put together your own reference style as to how to find that song or that piece of music. So, and that really kind of got them into realizing that was really important, that type of walkthrough. And I think that is a great way to make this. I think the whole idea of using a style of using the APA reference style book as palatable as possible. So, and if you want to assess in any way, you can give participation points. You might want them to post on your learning management system in your course, exactly what they did, however you wish to do that. Next slide, please. So once we did that, and I then gave further instruction about the publication manual. So I directed them to the reference list and reference examples, because now I want them to understand, now that you've put together those important pieces of data to make it into a reference for the song to help me go find the song, let's now think about how when we look at any type of article, whether it's scholarly, whether it's a newspaper article, magazine, blog post, whatever, there's a certain part that we begin with, and that is the author. So I wanted them to look through the reference list and see how really each one began with an author. Or with the organization, but basically that person or that body who put it together. So we went through all of that. And then I gave them, once they understood too, that you start with the author and that the author is formatted a certain way by last name, comma, first name, initial, period, all of that. And once we talked about it and we walked through it, we probably spent 15 minutes on that alone. I then had them to partner again. I find that these activities work well when they have somebody to work with, but I gave them first a sheet of paper that had 10 different entries, reference entries, and each one of these entries had something wrong with it. For instance, perhaps everything was capitalized. We don't do that. Perhaps the last name and the first name were all spelled out. Perhaps the year was at the end of the reference entry. So I had them work on their own sheet first, and there were different sheets. I prepared about 15 different variations so that no one person next to each other would get the same one. And I had them work on it first using their style books. So that got them to engage with the style book. And they had to make those corrections themselves. And then after about another 15 minutes, and it took a little bit longer than I thought it would, and I think it was because they were really trying to make these right, they then switched with their partner. So then they had to, and it was a different sheet. So they went through to see, did their partner get everything right on that sheet? And we went through it, we discussed it. There were some still some confusions, and so we worked through a lot to clarify that type of activity. And we discussed, why those changes then were necessary. And I do emphasize the need for consistency and how that is a language in itself. It helps all of us who are trying to find information to be able to read the same communication that way. So that's the importance of the style. Again, for the assessment, if you want them to submit the corrected references, you can, if you just want to award the participation points, however you wish to do that. But this was really a helpful way for them to work with the book. Next slide, please. All right, the source evaluation workshop. Now we're moving ahead. Now that we understand the formatting of how we treat our sources with the various pieces of the bibliographic data, now we need to evaluate sources when we are going to find them. So we're wanting to evaluate the credibility and relevance of sources. I do explain to them what credibility is. We kind of talk about that. And then also relevance, because the two are not exactly the same thing. Some sources could be perhaps some good credible ones, but are they really relevant to what you're talking about, to what your paper topic or any assignment that you'll be doing? So I wanted them to really understand the nuances between the terms. So the things that you'll need is, and I say a mix of sources, and what I mean by that really is just a list of some sources that you can put together. I'm going to show you in a few moments the next slide, not yet, but when we change slides, you'll see what I'm talking about. And then afterwards, I also prepare a small list of about 5 different sources in which they have to evaluate those. But the steps in this is that I share with them the criteria to evaluate sources that at least that I use. Many people use different criteria, but I show them the common ones. And then they're going to, again, get into their small groups or partner, and I give them a set of sources, and that's what this sheet of paper was. And then I ask them to evaluate each source based on the criteria, and then we do a share out near the end. And again, for the assessment, you can have them perhaps reflect on it and have them submit that justifies why they evaluate the sources the way they did. So next slide, please, and we'll go further. So this is what I shared with them in class. The criteria for evaluating sources, definitely looking at the author's credentials, publication date, the kind of item published. We as educators, we do want our learners to use more of the scholarly sources because they don't come across those on the daily. So we want them to use more of them, but I don't always discard the news articles or the blog post or some of the other things. It's just, it depends on whether it's relevant. Is it really going to be necessary for what you're discussing? But we go through a lot of that. Perhaps even where the item is published. in that particular publication. For instance, if they're wanting to use a news piece of some kind, that's great, but do they know if that is a news article or is it a news opinion? Is it included in the opinion section of the newspaper, or is it really more in the news pages? So that's, kind of important to recognize. What is the publication itself, and what kind of bias does it carry? All publications, even our most peer-reviewed and scholarly sources, there's always a degree of bias. There's no 100% objectivity. So I always make sure my students understand that. But it's okay to use sources that they think might they're going to be helpful, but they recognize that there's maybe a high degree of bias or any type of an extent of that. But it's important to recognize that. Next slide, please. And then we go through in class each one of these 5 sources that I made up. So these are not real sources. I want everybody to know that. These are just things I just put together on the fly. So I go through each one. I want them to see, first of all, again, reinforcing, because I think repetition is a good thing, but reinforcing the reference formatting for each one of these sources. So we're starting first with the author's last name, and I'll walk them through all of that again. And then look at the year, 2022, that's pretty recent. And then looking at the title and looking at the journal, the volume number, issue number, and the pages. And then I tell them that this is, definitely a journal, but I asked them, if you were working on a paper that talked about perhaps media coverage of climate change, would this be a possible source to use? And we talk about that for just a few moments. And then I go through the next one. The second one that you see would be from a newspaper. And again, 2023, that's recent, but it's a newspaper article. So justify that, or let's evaluate why or why not. There could be, good responses for either side of the argument. The third one, you can see there, it's a personal blog. But what about the author? What if the author is an expert in this field? Could that, even though it's a blog post, but could we use it? Okay. So again, we talk about the pros and cons of that. The next one is a government report. Again, what's the pros and cons on that? So we go through this entire process here. Took me 10 minutes because, again, I want to reinforce the formatting of the sources, and then I want us to evaluate those sources. Next slide, please. Okay. And then what I did, by the way, too, again, then after we did that, I gave them that sheet of paper, and then they had to go through themselves and evaluate each one of those. So the next activity is the advanced search simulation. So, okay, we now know how to format sources. We know why we need to follow the way that the format goes. We can evaluate them a little bit better. Now, how can we really find them? So I share with them some good search techniques to do that. And what you might want to do, and this is what I did, I had a separate tab open on my computer. So everything's connected to our projector in the classroom. And I had them kind of watch an example that I gave, and I'll show you that in a moment. And so I pulled up my university library's website, and I demonstrated the Boolean operators, how to do keywords, and then how do we filter our results. And so we went through a research question in class first, and then I gave each pair a research question in which they had to do the same. So they had to find 3 credible sources for the research question that they were given, and then discuss how they did that. In other words, I want to see the search string. I want to see those keywords used and what Boolean operators. And if they couldn't find things, then that's where my intervention took place, because there were some, they were like, we did this and this. And I'm like, yeah, let's try to truncate some of this stuff. Let's really think about what it is you're wanting to seek. What are some keywords even in that research question that we could start with? So we went through a lot of that quite a bit. And then we did some discussion of what they found. what were still some problems, and there's always going to be those, but that's the good opportunity to talk about those things. If you want to assess, you can have them to upload the keyword string, their basically their process, as well as the sources that they found, again, formatted APA style. So next. So this is what I showed them in class. So this is the actual one of the instructional slides. I said, we're going to use our Boolean operators, our keywords, and our filters. So I would have a tab open, and this was the thesis statement that we used for practice that I used, and they watched me as I did it. So using agenda setting theory, cultivation theory, and uses and gratifications theory, my project requires the use of 3 media theories. So that's why I did it this way. This research paper explores how mass media influences public perception, emphasizing the need for media literacy education. And then I asked, how could we find 3 credible sources? So this is where, as a class, I always have some of those students who are not afraid to speak up, and that's fine. But we would try different combinations of things. We tried, I said, remember, you got to have 3 theories. So maybe is there research already about how one of these theories connects to this topic? So I said, let's try agenda setting and public perception. And I also showed them, and when I say Boolean operators, I probably should have clarified, those include your ands, ors, quotation marks even, not. You're telling the algorithm what to find and what to yield in your research results. So once those sources populated, I then showed them how to filter. Perhaps we only want journal articles, which I do emphasize, but let's start there first. And then once we filtered that, I showed them how that number then decreased quite a bit. I said, it makes your search a little bit more meaningful and just more manageable. And then I said, and look, our results show a book, an article, etc. So that's already telling you what it is, but really, is it still credible? So let's open the source and look at it some more. So then we went through all of that. Next slide, please. And then the last big thing that we did, paraphrasing and in-text citations. And I will say, this is still a work in progress. It always will be. Here, we really want our students to take what they read. And I get this all the time, and I imagine you do too, but I like the way it's stated. Why should I try to put it in my own word when it's stated just perfectly? And I tell them, but that's not really what's important here. We need to really see your inner workings as to how you are making connections to this topic. So we do practice a little bit of paraphrasing and then citing sources within their writing. So here you'll need some excerpts from academic articles. And I did create some as well. So again, just some small slips of paper in which I did find, these are actual sources. So I would just find something and then copy and paste into it, gave them the source, and then they had to paraphrase. But we did go over the importance of paraphrasing and proper citation. And again, we did one in class, and I'll show you that in a moment. And then they went through their activity in which they had to paraphrase, and then they had to cite it in text, both as narrative and parenthetical. And then we would just review after, just a little bit after class, or not after class, but right near the end of class to talk more about that. I say this is a work in progress because some of the other assignments that they do, in which they're still, lifting quotations, even if it's just a one sentence, I'm like, no, you could really, this isn't profound enough. It doesn't really emphasize or add to anything. It's not substantial to even do even a partial quote. So let's really work on paraphrasing here. So that's why I say it's still a work in progress. All right, next slide, and then we'll walk through it. All right, so some other instructions as well that I gave them here. I tell them that if you rewrite a sentence or even a paragraph into your own words, you still must cite the source, and you have to do that because it's not our original idea. So we need to attribute or cite. I sometimes say attribute because in journalism speak, that is what we use, but you need to cite the source in the text. And this is the way we do it. Your parenthetical, it's parentheses. And it starts with the author's last name. So me, Shemberger, and then comma, and then the year and closed parentheses. I said your parenthetical, for the most part, is going to come at the end of the sentence with the period after the closed parentheses. Not always, but usually. And then your narrative, you want to use the narrative. You're going to find as you're working as you're on your media research papers that when you find some of these authors are coming across in different articles, that should tell you they're pretty much an expert in this field. I said you will see some common names throughout. Sometimes it's okay to start then Shemberger with that author's last name, because that's almost then a focal point saying, wow, this is a credible source. This source has been noted quite a bit in the literature already for this idea. So the author's name usually will start the sentence, and then the parentheses will include the year of publication only. And then you go on with the rest of the sentence. Next slide, please. I also tell them, yeah, we're not lifting material. Do not do it. And if you do, you're going to get the feedback. And the thing is I am a little bit lenient at the beginning, but if I'm still seeing some patterns, we have a conversation, and then some, reduction of points, because they do need to really work on paraphrasing. That's really important. The other thing is that if you cite the source in the text, there better be a reference at the end of the paper. So everything has to align, has to match. And so we really emphasize that. And that's really critical, because if I see the citation in the text, and let's say I want that source, where can I find it? I said, remember that activity we did at the very beginning in which, we're doing a reference building challenge? You're telling me what's important. I need more info so I can go to the reference list and find it. And I have to admit that part has been working really well. So I have seen some improvements there. So I do think that helps them to see, well, if I cited it, I better have that full reference. Next slide, please. Now, I'm not going to read this verbatim, but this is the activity that we did in class as a whole. So this is the full paragraph, and I tell them that I took it, I copied it right there. I need to paraphrase it. I said, when you paraphrase, look to see really what's the main idea. Read the paragraph. If you really like something in there that's caught your eye, what is it about it that is speaking to you? Put it in your own words. Start with keywords first. Just jot some things down, and then you can make it into a coherent sentence. So they took a moment to look at that paragraph, and they see the source. Okay. And so we kind of looked at that. I did read it to them in class, but I'm not going to read it to you here. But you get the idea that that's what we started with. And then the next slide. And then, okay, I paraphrased it. I took that big paragraph, and this is what I got away with it. So I then showed them the parenthetical way of citing it, of citing that paraphrased excerpt. And you can see that. So I was able to, I basically reflected, and here is what we have right here. And I used the parenthetical citation, which came at the end of that sentence. I then explained to them the Smith and the ampersand symbol. I said, this is what we use in the parenthetical. And again, note the year. And then because I cited it, I provided the full reference at the end. So again, they matched. And then next slide. And this next slide will show the narrative citation. So again, this is where I'm starting with Smith and Johnson, and then the year of publication. I said, notice I spell out and in this case. So we only use ampersand pretty much when we're talking about citations within the parenthetical. I said, again, I've got the narrative citation. I must reference it at the end. And then next. I think that should be pretty much it for me. I will say too, and I forgot to say this at the beginning, involve your librarian if you have one, because our library week then ended with her. She was able to show them a few more things. So it really built each time. And I think that's what has made this so helpful. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Melony. That was fantastic. I think that I believe Andrea has been communicating in the chat that you will get access to these activities as well as the slides. So I know that not everybody is teaching a full information literacy class. So you might not be able to incorporate every single one. You might be teaching online and it might be a little bit more difficult, but hopefully there are elements of these activities that you can incorporate throughout.
Mhm.
We will have about 10 minutes for questions. So get your questions into the Q&A. But before we do that, I did want to just really quickly let you know that we are partnering with ACRL Choice for our next webinar. And Andrea will put she will put the link to register. There's also the QR code. But basically, it's called First Impressions Matter, Top APA Style Orientation Essentials. It is geared towards librarians, but I think a lot of the faculty member here might be interested if you do have like a short period of time to teach elements of APA style. So definitely register for that, get more information with that if you think that might be something that you'd be interested in. So I believe Tim is going to join us for our questions. So and Melony is going to be kind enough to answer questions as well. So be sure to get your questions in the Q&A, and we would love to hear them.
Yeah, so thank you to everyone who submitted questions in Q&A. Also, thank you to everyone who participated in the chat today. I think there were some wonderful discussions happening about asynchronous instruction and DOI. There's a huge discussion on DOI happening in the chat. So thank you to everyone for participating. I think the first question we've got here is please address good role modeling. Is it necessary to cite course textbooks in classroom presentations, or is the source assumed?
I do make my students. So, okay. So in other assignments, they have to use information from my class lectures. They have to incorporate that. And yes, they do have to cite it and reference it. And then they have to use our course e-textbook. Again, I want them to where by the time they finish the course, to be able to have a good working knowledge of how to use or how to format sources as references. I just think it's important. So I do it. Now I can understand, and even the courses that I'm taking at the University of Arizona, my professors don't really require it because they do assume, we're all working with this same knowledge. But I'm like, yeah, I'm just in the habit of it. And I want my learners to have the same habit.
Yeah, I think wherever you can show, one of the tips that I like to give is to make sure you're teaching APA style incrementally over the course of the degree itself, whatever that happens to be, but also over the course of your class. So something like just giving them that exposure of seeing the citations, seeing the references again and again can be helpful. Tim, do you have anything to add? Great.
I'm going to take that as a no. Okay. The next question is, how do you teach the location of an article within a publication when most students are finding articles online through a web search or library database? I don't know if Tim wants to tackle that one or.
Yeah, because I want Tim or somebody else because I think I'm understanding the question right, but I'd like to hear their responses.
So for APA style for us, the purpose of citing a source is so somebody else can find it, right? And that person's not going to necessarily have access to the same databases in the same place that you did. So we're less interested in what database, what Google search, things like that you used, and more interested in something that can be retrieved by anybody. So if it is like a database situation or something like that, we would be more interested in the journal and using, a journal article reference instead of focusing on the database that was used. However, your methods section and stuff like that, there are good places to kind of incorporate that. Does anybody else on the APA style team want to have any thoughts there?
That basically would be my answer as well. We focus on the the reference type, not so much where you got it. So you got a journal article, you might have gotten it online, you might have it at the library. You're going to put the information about that article in your reference, and someone else has all those same options and more about where they may find that same material. And then that would be the same for podcast. You might have listened to the podcast on Spotify, and I watched it on YouTube, but you're just citing the reference as a podcast episode. And I apologize for not chiming in on the last answer. I was typing away.
I get it. You're going to be lost in the responses. Happens to me all the time. So there's a question here about publishers' practices of publishing content online as extra content that doesn't make it into the original like hard copy journal or newspaper is an issue that Kimberly is experiencing. It's hard to cite in a way that isn't confusing to the user. So when someone is citing an online reference that doesn't make it into print, is there stronger guidance on calling it out that it's an internet source versus a print source, I guess is the question.
That's an interesting question. I would wonder in that situation if it has like a journal article number or something like that, because it wouldn't be associated with, the actual print journal. Tim, what are your thoughts?
I was trying to see the written question because I'm not 100% sure I understand, but generally speaking, just for an article, the reference is identical if you read it on paper in front of you. If it has a DOI, we'd still recommend putting the DOI in there because someone else might use that DOI to get to it, or vice versa. If you read it online and it doesn't have a DOI and that DOI doesn't go in the reference. So it's the URL or the DOI, because DOIs are formatted as URLs, are don't noticeably affect the reference because they're at the end.
There was some discussion in the chat about asynchronous teaching, and I was wondering, Melony, if you had any advice for instructors that only teach asynchronously on how to kind of convert some of those activities that you shared into an online environment.
Absolutely. So, that's a good thing that this question was asked, because I am teaching this class in the fall, but asynchronously. So I am having to go through the practice of transferring a lot of this into the asynchronous learning space. So how can we do that? So I think the discussion boards are going to have to be great for this. Now, whether it's a text response or an audio or whatever, or maybe you have students create some very small slide deck presentations or whatever. So let me back up. So for instance, let's start with that very first activity of the reference building challenge. You could have a very small number of points, perhaps assigned to it, or no points, but have a discussion board thread created in which they have to enter. Basically they have to kind of work on their own a little bit, but then finally submit what that reference would look like to them for helping you to find that song. So that could be something. And then you could have some interactions that way. And of course, I'm thinking as I go along with this, because like I said, I'm starting to think about this for my course next fall. The other things too, I wonder if perhaps with some of the other activities, could you have, and it depends again, probably on your LMS, but some peer review type opportunities. So for instance, if we were to use let's see, I'm trying to think of which activity might be more applicable to this. Let's do this. So let's do the paraphrasing and in-text citations. So here you would provide basically an excerpt from an article. and you give the source as well. And you want them to maybe work together, perhaps on paraphrasing. So maybe you could have them kind of partner up in a peer review process where they both will still paraphrase, but they're going to review each other's to see, did they kind of get the same thing? So that way we know, are we getting some of the similar takeaways, the main ideas from that excerpt, and see if they could try to interact that way. I try to incorporate some of that I think that interaction is so important in their learning process. That's why I do emphasize some of that social interaction there. But I think a lot of these activities, it's going to take some planning. So I will just say that to make this work. And I know it can work. It's just a matter of some creativity and planning, and to really rely maybe on that discussion board to facilitate a lot of this.
Andrea, you muted.
Thanks. I was just asking if any of our panelists had any questions that they spotted in Q&A or chat that they wanted to address before the end of our session.
I like the one that I just saw in the Q&A for Melony. Let me see if I can read it. Emily asks, is there a framing narrative to offer with these library workshop activities? As in, how do you explain to students the idea of expertise itself? Do you talk about the disciplines and how their research connects to the world?
I haven't extensively talked to them about that other than just some basic examples. So to give you an idea, and I did use this example in class, and I think this is pointing to the essence of this question. I said, you know, they know a little bit about my background. I used to be an education journalist, so that's what I did for several years before entering teaching. I covered school boards and education issues. And I said, let's say if you're doing a paper about social media use among education journalists, and let's say you came across something that I wrote and it was in a blog that I did, and my blog focused a lot on education news. Is that something that you think could be relevant? And we would talk about that, because my credibility then as an education journalist, I am extending the thought space, the marketplace of ideas, if you will, into a blog dimension. My work, though, has not been reviewed by an editor, has not gone through that process, but I do cover education. So, you know, we go through some of those types of examples. I do tell them that sometimes if you don't know enough about that author, that means you're going to have to do a little bit more digging. And perhaps that might not be time that you have. And if you don't have that kind of time, then perhaps that source needs to be set aside for a little bit. But that's kind of, if I understand that question correctly, that is one of the things that we did talk about 3 weeks ago, in fact.
Great.
Okay, good. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I want to thank all of our panelists for all of their great presentations and help answering questions. And thank you to all of our attendees for wonderful participation. We appreciate you all, and we hope to see you next month at our choice webinar. Please look out for more emails with recordings, slides, resources, attendance certificates. There's much more to come from us. So thank you to everyone for being here today, and we will see you next time. Bye all.